Do you truly cherish your family? Might you be taking them for granted just because they are always there? What I'm about to share is my own true story. My name is Jennifer, and I'm 45 years old. I'd like to tell you about the time I most deeply pondered what family means. Let's go back about 15 years. Back then, I was a fashion magazine editor. My life was entirely consumed by work. In the world of editing, there's hardly any time for romance. Yet, everyone was trying to make the most of their precious 30s, squeezing in time for social gatherings and dates. Back in those days, security was a bit laxer, so it wasn't unusual to meet up with a significant other while juggling work. But I was never good at creating free time or space in my life. Work always came first, and romance was the first to suffer. I was the type to unintentionally be rude to my partner. The one who showed interest in someone like me was my beloved and rather unique husband, Michael. He was also an editor at the same company. However, we worked on different magazines, so we didn't interact much. We often ended up working late until around the same time, which meant we ran into each other a lot in the elevator on our way home. That's what eventually brought us together. We both took pride in our work and neglected romance, making us quite similar. Sometimes, we'd passionately discuss the future of magazines as comrades. Our relationship was so devoid of romance that it took a while for us to become a couple, but now as a married couple. We understand each other better than anyone. It was my husband who suggested we split the household chores to ensure we both could work efficiently. We didn't assign fixed duties. Instead, whoever noticed something needed to be done or had the time would take care of it. Which meant no stress for either of us. We were a couple who could talk about anything and were like best friends. One day, my father-in-law contacted my husband. He said my mother-in-law had broken her dominant arm and needed someone to live with them and help out until she recovered. To be honest, I was puzzled at this point. My husband's parents and his younger brother lived in their family home. With 2 adults already there, it seemed unbelievable that they'd need someone to live in to help. I couldn't help but ask my husband, do they really need help? He replied, I said the same thing. But they insist they can't manage without help, which seems unlikely. Moreover, my husband didn't get along well with his younger brother, Chris, and was somewhat estranged from his family. Chris frequently changes jobs, none of which he keeps for more than a year. It seems he is currently unemployed. He claims, I'm making money from gambling, treating gambling as if it's his job. My husband had once found him a job through his connections, but Chris left without notice, forcing my husband to apologize profusely to the employer. However, my father-in-law never scolds Chris. In fact, he tends to intervene protectively whenever my mother-in-law gets angry. As it was my husband's family matter, I stayed silent, but naturally, my husband was frustrated and sided with his mother. But in the end, my father-in-law and Chris's attitudes didn't change. After that, my husband said, just seeing my father and brother irritates me, which led him to become distant from his family home. Though he was estranged. It was only to the extent of not visiting the house. He made sure to maintain some contact with my mother-in-law and father-in-law. He would have preferred to cut off contact with his father as well. But it wasn't possible because his father would be the one to contact him if anything happened to his mother. Amidst this, the request for support came not from my injured mother-in-law but from my father-in-law. Even though my father-in-law, who hadn't re-employed after retirement, so that now 2 unemployed men in the house. I had a bad feeling about this, but with no clear understanding of the situation, I was utterly clueless. Should I go and help? My husband said with a sigh. My husband is currently involved in the launch of a new magazine, a key project for him. This magazine is a children's publication, something he has dreamed of doing for many years. He really wanted to give his all to this project. On the other hand, I was in a position where I could easily take a significant amount of time off due to major reorganizations in the magazine I was involved with. Let those who can, do. That's our family motto, right? I can count on you to take care of things here. When I said that with a smile, my husband reluctantly replied, I should go. I don't want you to face any unpleasantness because of my family's issues. But seeing my eagerness, he eventually gave in. Don't worry, I'll handle whatever comes our way. And so, I went to help with the household chores in place of my husband. Thank you for coming, Jennifer. I know you're busy with work. I'm sorry. My mother-in-law greeted me apologetically. She was wearing a cast on her arm. Even now, as she aged, she was an active insurance agent, bustling with energy. My mother-in-law in a cast seems painful. For starters, I asked about what needed to be done and the general routine, like meal times. That's when it happened. Hey. I'm going to work, so give me some money. Stomping in was Chris, who had significantly, well, let's say, expanded since I last saw him. What's this about needing money for work? It's probably for gambling. If he's calling it work, he shouldn't be taking money but earning it instead. Not again. We're out of money, just stay home, my mother-in-law raised her voice. I silently agreed, but then Chris retorted, shut up. Do you want me to throw a fit? My mother-in-law flinched for a moment, then silently went to fetch her wallet, from which she pulled out $200 and handed it to Chris. Thanks, he said, flipping the bills and heading out the door. Wait, what? We're just giving him that? I was stunned. I thought, if that bulk started rampaging, it would be like a pinball, but my mother-in-law looked genuinely scared. Was it okay to give him the money? I asked. She looked down and then silently nodded. I was not okay with this, and it didn't sit right with me. Within 30 minutes of my arrival, I was already itching to complain to my husband, but he was at work, so I held back. I have a short temper. If Chris had demanded money from me, I wouldn't have hesitated to confront him. But since my mother-in-law didn't retaliate, I kept my mouth shut for the time being. At the same time, I realized I needed to keep a closer eye on this household. But that seemed to be the only issue. The day ended, and I wondered if Chris was the only problem. The next day, I accompanied my mother-in-law to the hospital since she had a doctor's appointment. We had an appointment, but the hospital was crowded, and we returned home later than planned, where my father-in-law greeted us. I expected a simple welcome back, but I was mistaken. The first thing he said was, the bathroom isn't ready, and he was angry about it. Despite it being only 3 p.m. My father-in-law was upset that the bathroom hadn't been cleaned because he wanted to take a shower early due to sweating. I nearly told him to clean it himself, but I held back, remembering I am the daughter-in-law and should stay quiet as long as my mother-in-law does. However, my mother-in-law was about to head to the bathroom, saying, I'm sorry. I exclaimed, no, you can't clean the bath with that injury. I hurried to stop her and took over the cleaning. After finishing, I went to check on my mother-in-law. Expecting her to be resting after the hospital visit, I found her instead starting to prepare dinner. I'll help, I offered. Then my father-in-law said, that's great. It'll speed up the work a bit, and laughed heartily. How annoying. I couldn't help but glare at my father-in-law. Worried I had been too obvious, it turned out to be an unnecessary concern. He was so engrossed in the TV, sitting on the sofa, that he didn't even notice me. To top it all off, he had the audacity to say, give me a shoulder massage later. I couldn't believe he could say such things after seeing my mother-in-law's injured hand. I was so upset that dinner tasted bland that night. Chris complained about the meal, and my father-in-law demanded my injured mother-in-law to serve him drinks. I wanted to protest, but had to consider my mother-in-law's feelings. In just 2 days, I clearly saw how little regard my mother-in-law was held in this household. It wasn't like this the last time I visited. When I was alone with my mother-in-law, I couldn't help but ask, why don't you say anything to your husband and son? Isn't this normal for most families, she wondered. What kind of households are you talking about? At least ours isn't like that. When I said this, my mother-in-law's eyes widened in surprise. According to her, when she complained about this situation at work, her colleagues laughed it off, saying, that's just how it is everywhere, wives are always busy. She had resigned herself to thinking that if everyone else endured it, it must be acceptable. What are you saying? Other families are other families, ours is ours. Even if other households are like that. Don't convince yourself that something you feel is wrong is actually okay. I urged her. She murmured in agreement, you're right. I learned that this situation began a year ago when my father-in-law retired. Initially, his demands were tolerable, common even, like asking, when's dinner? It's probably common in many households for husbands to not do housework even when they're at home. Until then, my mother-in-law had thought it was a frustrating but unavoidable situation. But gradually, my father-in-law's complaints increased. He became dissatisfied if meals or schedules didn't go his way. Eventually, he became unscrupulous in fulfilling his desires, resorting to somewhat plausible lies like, "The doctor said I can't have American food because it's high in fat," to push his demands. Of course, he would forget his own lie and demand fatty dishes the next day. My mother-in-law was caught in a cycle of his whims, criticized whether the food was too fatty or too light. Naturally, my mother-in-law became unable to fulfill those impossible demands. As a result, my father-in-law started to look down on her as someone who can't properly do cleaning or housework. Seeing this, Chris also started looking down on her, joining his father in disdain due to his unresolved grievances. Besides complaining alongside his father, Chris stooped to extorting money. My mother-in-law, unable to overlook this behavior, scolded him, asserting it was wrong. However, Chris, who had been on a losing streak at gambling, one day he snapped her while they had a conversation. As a result, she ended up getting injured above her eyebrow when Chris threw a remote control at her with full force. It wasn't an intentional injury but a mishap while trying to drive her out of the room. Had I been there, I might have thrown a chair back at him. But my mother-in-law isn't that type of person. "It's enough that I don't want anything more to happen," was a sufficient event to weaken her stance towards Chris. Knowing this, Chris began to threaten to throw a tantrum whenever his whims were not met. I thought, what a despicable situation. In the end, despite there being 3 adults in the house, the only one working and doing household chores was my mother-in-law. The 2 men were just freeloading off her. And yet, they had the nerve to act all high and mighty, which is the height of shamelessness. "If it gets too tough, you can always escape to our place. It's okay to say no to things you don't like," I said. At my words, my mother-in-law looked down with a complicated expression. "You're right. I feel a bit relieved knowing it's not normal. I thought I was just being too sensitive," she said. With that, she smiled, saying, "Let's go to bed for today," and ended the conversation. I might have overstepped my bounds, I thought. But I don't believe my actions were wrong. I resolved to help my mother-in-law with all my might if needed. The next morning, due to the rain and atmospheric pressure, my mother-in-law seemed to be in poor physical condition, not just her hand. Just as I decided to do my best to support her without overburdening her. "Mom, take me to the casino," Chris said as he came down from the 2nd floor. I inadvertently blurted out, "What?" but Chris didn't notice. "Hey, there's no newspaper. Go get it from the mailbox," my father-in-law chimed in. I glared, thinking he could go to the nearby mailbox himself, but of course, he remained seated on the sofa. It seems that statue only moves when bodily functions dictate. Is he considering himself some kind of fixture in this house? While I was seething with anger, my mother-in-law said nothing. Usually, she would respond with a yes, or some other affirmative before starting the task. Her silence and inaction made me wonder, had my persuasion the day before had an effect? As I watched uneasily, my father-in-law demanded, "What's taking so long? Hurry up." Even Chris began to say, "I'm waiting for you to get ready." Why is silence taken as consent in this house? It's infuriating. Just as my patience reached its limit and I was about to give them a piece of my mind. "I absolutely will not do it," was shouted by my mother-in-law. It was so loud, I think it was the first time I'd heard her raise her voice, leaving my father-in-law and Chris stunned. "Please do it yourself. I'm not fond of 2 grown children." Well said. I felt like jumping for joy. "Go, mother-in-law, you're amazing." As I was mentally giving her a high five, my father-in-law let out a huge sigh. All talk and no action. "Fine, leave if you want. Go on, get out," he said, smirking as if he thought she wouldn't dare, only looking over from the sofa at that moment. "Yeah, Mom, you should leave," Chris laughed along. "You guys. I understand." Just as I was about to yell, it was my mother-in-law who calmly agreed to leave. "Then I will leave. Let's go together, Jennifer," she said. I felt an instant lift in my spirits despite my irritation. With an uncontrollable smile, I said, "Yes," and immediately called a taxi to leave the house with my mother-in-law. I wanted to take her back with us before she could change her mind. After settling her in at our place, I called my husband to update him on the situation. I hadn't yet informed him about the events of the past 2 days. I was so ready to jump into action myself that I forgot to consult and gather allies. And to think, it's his family we're talking about. When I explained the situation, my husband somehow managed to wrap up his work incredibly early and came home that day. Can you believe how capable my husband is? And then the three of us discussed what to do next. My mother-in-law, now fully awakened, was relentless. With a smile, she said something brutal, "Let's make their lives difficult over there." Normally gentle, but indeed a savvy agent. It made me realize she had truly been enduring, thinking, it's normal, so I must bear it. But enduring such for a year shows she must be incredibly resilient at heart. She declared loudly, "I won't return until they're miserably begging." The next day, she cancelled their cell phone plans and emptied the bank account used for utility payments. We thought they'd notice once the cell service stopped and come begging, but both my mother-in-law and husband doubted it. Apparently, neither my father-in-law nor Chris had ever handled the bills, so they were clueless about how things worked. And with both unemployed, it's not like they were expecting calls from anyone. This was still the era of basic phones. The chances of them, not being tech-savvy, using the phones were slim. My husband and mother-in-law joked, they might just think it's a bad signal and not realize. Regarding the utilities, they won't notice the non-payment due to automatic withdrawals, my mother-in-law chuckled. To think they were such individuals, incapable of managing not just household chores but their own lives. Unfortunately, it seems there was some money left at home for living expenses. Enough to cover meals for about 3 months, she says. That is, of course, if it's not wasted. A month and a half later. Bro. Mom's there with you, right? Please, tell her to pay the bills. It's unbearable without AC in this heat. A pathetic call from Chris, almost in tears, reached my husband. Since the cell service was cut, he had to find a public phone to make the call. It was summer. Though not as severe as the current heat waves, the electricity cutoff was evident. Normally, the unpaid bills should have been a giveaway, but just as my mother-in-law predicted, they hadn't noticed. Waking up to the heat in the morning and finding that none of the lights worked, they panicked and called the power company, only to be told, "You have an outstanding balance." My husband, upon hearing Chris's plea right after picking up the call, promptly hung up. He can be quite the devil when he wants to be. I love that about him. It seemed they also tried calling our house, but I deliberately didn't answer upon seeing the number. It was at my mother-in-law's request. Another half a month went by. 2 months after my mother-in-law's revenge preparations began. Coming home from work, I found Chris and my father-in-law sobbing outside our house. "Please, let me see Mom. The water's been cut off." Chris begged. "Jennifer, I'm begging too. The toilets, they won't flush," my father-in-law added. I nearly burst into laughter at their pleas. Desperate, yes, but their earnestness was almost comical. Not wanting them to linger at the door, I decided to inform my mother-in-law. She appeared before them, saying, "Let's have a talk, shall we?" Just then, my husband arrived, and we all went inside to discuss. "What brings the two of you, utterly clueless about the world, here?" my mother-in-law started. The two couldn't even look her in the eye, hanging their heads. "I'm at my limit. I'm sorry. Please come back." Chris apologized. My father-in-law followed suit. "I'm also at my limit just looking at the two of you, but what should we do in that case, I wonder?" My mother-in-law said with a mischievous smile, glancing at me, so I laughed along and said, "Indeed, what should be done about that?" "You don't have to go back ever, Mom," my husband began to smirk. "Yeah, really. Who'd want to go back to babysitting 2 grown individuals?" The moment my mother-in-law said that, Chris exclaimed, "Oh, me. I'll work. I'll work." But we didn't miss the instant his face turned into a "wait, what" expression. Probably, work was just a spur-of-the-moment lie. But this was an opportunity. "Then write a pledge that you'll work diligently from now on, no matter what," my husband challenged him. Huh? As my husband hastily prepared paper and pen and handed them to Chris, it was clear Chris was completely caught up in our pace. Here, write it down. From now on, you'll live on your own money and take care of Mom, my husband urged him. Rushed by my husband, Chris ended up signing the pledge before he knew it. His face grew paler by the second. If you break this, all your assets go to Mom. My husband warned, though his words held no legal weight. Yet, the intimidation in his voice was enough to convey he'd make it happen no matter what. Chris answered in a small voice, understood. Your turn, honey, my mother-in-law said. Don't think I'll come back just because he's working. If you don't change, it's still just another big kid around, she told him. What? I don't know, my father-in-law blurted out in panic. Huh? That's okay? Then Dad, you leave that house. Is that okay, Mom? As my husband said this, my mother-in-law smirked mischievously, that's not enough. What else shall we do? How about selling that watch Dad treasures? Ah, that's a great idea. Let's do that. And then, the moment my husband and mother-in-law started listing things to sell, my father-in-law slammed the table and stood up. All right, I get it. I'll do anything, just come back, please. As he finished speaking, my father-in-law slumped down, defeated. Anything? Like what exactly will you do? At my mother-in-law's words, my father-in-law let out a gasp, what? The atmosphere and his evident fear of my mother-in-law must have overwhelmed him. I'll help with the housework. And cleaning. That's normal, Dad. We live together, so helping out is the wrong mindset. You're just taking care of your own things. What makes you so entitled, my husband said, clearly exasperated. All of it, my mother-in-law demanded. Yes. My father-in-law responded weakly. Being unemployed, even doing all the housework might not be enough, my husband added. With tears in his eyes, my father-in-law said, I'll do whatever I can. It must have been a mix of shame and defiance at being scolded by his son. Thus, the whole ordeal ended with my mother-in-law agreeing to return home, on the condition that all her demands were met. 10 years have passed since then. Chris struggled with job interviews but managed to get hired for a part-time job at a local restaurant chain he used to frequent as a child. Surrounded mostly by younger colleagues, there were times he was pushed hard and felt worn out. However, he seemed to realize that if he quit, there was nowhere else that would hire him, who had been unemployed for a long time. And he continued to work with a guts that he had never had before. His hard work paid off, and he was offered a full-time position after 5 years, eventually becoming the manager last year. A late bloomer, indeed. My mother-in-law, no longer able to keep up with the demanding role, has now settled into being a homemaker. As promised, my father-in-law is in charge of the household chores. My father-in-law seems to have found joy in housework after giving it a try. Lately, he's become so passionate about cooking that he's even serving gourmet meals at home. We sometimes enjoy his delicious dishes. Indeed, there have been changes for us as a couple too. My husband has been promoted to editor-in-chief. Truly proud of my husband. His dream project, a children's magazine, was a hit, leading to his exceptional rise. Now, I am the wife of an editor-in-chief. Yet, I remain just an editor. This is because I've been on maternity leave, prioritizing children over work. Now, I am a mother of 3 boys and 1 girl. Though every day is hectic, prioritizing my children has proven to be more fulfilling than work. Sometimes, my mother-in-law and father-in-law come over to help with the kids, so despite having many children, I don't feel overly burdened. This isn't because we asked for help, but because they help when they can, by those who can. Not confined by roles like being a wife or husband, but doing what one can do. Without sacrificing anyone. I think this approach to family life might be the most natural and effortless way to happiness. For each of us to be our true selves, not just a mom or a dad. I intend to continue cherishing my family with all my might. I hope everyone looks out for their family members, ensuring no one is struggling or sacrificing for someone else. I believe that's a shortcut to happiness.